Hello, everyone. I'm Nicholas Death Porter Stranding Bridges Tyson, and I'm here with my lovely co-host with the one-word name, Lauren. Lauren, how are you doing?
I am doing great, thank you. However, I like Lauren Porter Bridges Strand. Ash, thank you very much. Who also played with the additional Rob Porter Bridges Strand.
Yeah. That's Lauren's partner, for everyone who doesn't know, who is a lovely human being and
absolutely my tag team partner when it comes to these really large open worlds, because instead of playing 4 hours on my own, I can play 8 hours because 4 of them are swap hot.
That's true. Rob is like the Twitch mechanics master of masters. I can get by, but he is...
Oh, he trudged too. He definitely trudged, but I was a good trudger. I was the one that tackled the mountain.
and here we are slogging through this podcast episode like a man walking through tar. Hello, everybody. So it's the Fruity Dashi podcast, and today we are actually moving on to the final Metal Gear game that just so happens to be called Death Stranding. And we are going to explain that over the course of this episode. But first and foremost, I wanted to remind everyone that we have a Patreon. That's patreon.com/Footydashi, where we will be discussing even more in-depth information regarding Death Stranding. In addition to that, we have a huge backlog of bonus episodes that you can go through. You can hear all of our incredibly interesting game design and game critique thoughts, but you have to pay $5 a month, unfortunately. However, also, you could also, DM me and make a sob story case, and I'd probably give you a free subscription. But don't let that spread too widely, because today we're going to be discussing 2019's Death Stranding. Lauren, do you have any initial thoughts about this game before we get into sort of the nitty-gritty?
Yeah. So my big thing with this game that I really, really enjoyed, and I wish I had, for context, I played kind of the first kind of portion or the first map of Death Stranding pretty much when it came out. But my friends immediately took it back, as they should have. It was their copy after all, and played the rest of it and then moved away. And then I never really played it kind of since, because in 2020, after 2019, we all know I played this game during the 2020 COVID pandemic. And it was definitely a topical game at the time, one could say. But then another amazing kind of open world game came out in 2020, and that was Cyberpunk 2077. And the reason why I'm kind of bringing up both experiences is because it's really important to understand, I think, the reason why this game got so incredibly popular and really made such a thematic impact, I think, at the time, but that it also can continue to make that impact, at least for me, today. And I think the biggest thing to kind of call out is that Nicholas and I had incredibly different player experiences.
Yes.
I was on Sony's PlayStation 5, and Nicholas was playing on a PC.
Yep.
I had a lot of more multiplayer options, and Nicholas didn't actually at all. So this is a really fascinating example. When you look at Death Stranding and you think of a Kojima game, I definitely believe we can say, at least I can say, that auteur, as it were, or the author of a game, perhaps this is the game that has made me realize the auteur theory does hold some truth to it. And throughout this experience of, I guess, listening to us in this episode, it'll be really fascinating for you to kind of see the reasons why we make the arguments we make, knowing they've been colored by our gameplay experiences. So Nicholas, take it away with kind of the history for Kojima and the development and how we even got to, say, the Death Stranding in the first place.
Why is the last Metal Gear game not called Metal Gear? And first we have to go back to the year 2015. 2015, for those of you who recall, is the year that The Phantom Pain came out. And in the same year, Kojima was, and there's not a lot of good sourcing on this, probably pushed out of Konami. There are a couple of reasons for this. One, okay, so the sort of like structural reason is that Konami is not a game company. Konami is a large holding company that has a lot of subunits, one of which is a digital entertainment division. And then within the digital entertainment division, video games was one of the things that they were doing. And the reason why this is important is because it informs Konami's subsequent, I guess you could say, restructuring and the way in which they approached video games from basically 2015 forward. So in the early 2010s, they saw a great deal of success with a pretty cheap to make, like collectible card game for mobile called, I believe it's called Dungeon Collection. Don't quote me on that if I'm wrong. Anyway, there was a game that they made a ton of money. It was really cheap to make. So they're looking at an environment where there's this game being made by this guy who, frankly, is kind of a pain in the ass to work with. And his game was costing so much money over so many years where there was no return. They're like, we're not going to do this anymore. We don't think this is a good strategy for making money. And basically ever since, Konami hasn't really done much new game development. I mean, they basically have their money printers. They have Yu-Gi-Oh!, they have Pachinko, and then they have a bunch of mobile games that are all kind of just rehashing the same thing with each iteration. There was no real attempt to sort of like create a new thing. So in that environment, it didn't make a whole lot of sense for them to keep on somebody who was costing them a lot of money, even though he also made them a lot of money, and didn't really fit with their sort of like the way in which their strategy was going to be going forward. However, it was also probably a little bit more acrimonious than that. For a time, Kojima had been operating in a kind of quasi-independent manner with his own sort of like little carve-out studio. He had also attempted to like create a satellite studio in the US in Los Angeles. And within the context of, like, there's this cliche in Japanese that, like, the nail that sticks up is the one that gets pounded back down. It is a bit of a cliche, but there is some truth in it in that, like, Japanese corporate culture is extremely, especially, like, old school companies like Konami, is extremely conservative and extremely hierarchical. So in that environment, this guy who is kind of a, fuck you, I'm going to do my own thing character, probably eventually just got on their nerves. So when, you know, a new guy took over the holding company, Konami, in 2014, basically Kojima's days were kind of numbered. And the thing is, like, to get a sense of how acrimonious this was, it wasn't just Kojima. Most of the senior people who worked for him were also subsequently reclassified, not as employees, but as contractors. So I have to explain a little, like, Japanese corporate culture to explain like what a huge snub this is. So in Japanese companies, generally speaking, especially like large corporations, they don't fire you outright. And part of the reason for that has to do with employment laws in Japan, but also with corporate culture. What they do instead is they basically make your life miserable in the company until you quit. And so that's essentially what this is. This is Konami basically shitting on all of these people who worked for Kojima in order to essentially drive them out. And the thing is, and this came out in interviews with one of the composers who had worked with Kojima, Muranaka. I mean, she claimed that, you know, he could be extremely uncompromising, and that's both positive and negative, because it meant that, like, oftentimes he would lose scope of things. He would like try. In fact, actually, Phantom Pain is a really good example of this. There's just so many features in Phantom Pain that it's like, you know, half this game kind of didn't need to exist. Like if they had just focused on like the core gameplay and actually a lot more on the story than they did, then it wouldn't have become so bloated. And it felt like a really bloated game as a result. So like there are a lot of things that are working against Kojima, and also the fact that like, it was possible that at that point he had enough clout on his own that he could create his own studio. And that's what he did. He created his own studio, and their first game was this one, Death Stranding.
And I think that what's really interesting to point out is that this is kind of a similar pattern we're seeing even in the game industry today.
Yeah, definitely.
Like, right? Maybe not, you could say, at the scale, or not even so scale. We definitely see it at scale, but maybe not the notoriety, right, that Kojima gets for leaving, right, Konami.
Yeah.
Is that I think a lot of it really kind of comes under the radar in America, where we are having a bunch of people, maybe now that are starting to get the clout, that are creating these entire new franchises or new creative direction opportunities within an existing company, such as Microsoft, for example. And then are, right, rightfully snubbed, to be honest. They are laid off, they're redundant, and they have to go out and they create their own studios, for better or for worse, right? Whether or not there are people that wanted to take that leadership opportunity. Running a studio is a lot different, right, than being a game director within an existing company. But the fact that not only were his team also let go, which is also something we're seeing today, and the fact that they followed him to this new studio, and that this Death Stranding not only had to be, say, a departure from what they were making, but it also had to be very similar, I believe, to kind of what they were making to kind of understand kind of their market positioning. So for me, when we talk about how Death Stranding is the last I was going to say the last Kojima game, excuse me, the last Kojima directed, you could say, Metal Gear Solid. I think in part it kind of comes down to the fact that they had to kind of use a lot of kind of the similar mechanics, but also because that is something that was his bread and butter, is something that he's been trying to refine with every iteration of his game. And that's definitely a type of kind of direction style, you could say, where some game directors want to create a new game that's completely different every time. And a lot of others want to say, hey, I'm really good at the action over the top genre, so I'm going to make an action over the top experience every single time. And that's Suda 51 for anybody who's not understanding where I'm going with that. Versus the reason why I talk about the auteur is that it's like, at the end of the day, Kojima might not be pushing, you could say, the innovation button, even for other game directors out there. But damn, playing this game, I absolutely was like, yes, this is Phantom Pain, the better one.
Yeah, it is a, well, so the way I described it to Lauren in our show notes is that, to me, it felt like Death Stranding is an attempt to kind of like take up a lot of the questions that were raised both thematically, in terms of game mechanics, really across the board, by the Phantom Pain, and sort of like readdress them, or like either double down on some of the things that Phantom Pain was doing, but then also sort of like critique it either implicitly or in some cases explicitly. And you see a lot of this, especially with regards to the character Cliff, who basically is like a Metal Gear protagonist, but he's not the protagonist of this game.
So let's look at this mechanically first, because I want to talk about the introduction to this game, which I really think they nailed. Whenever I kind of mentor students, or I mentor other game developers, or I, just talk to people in general, really, you get me in a coffee shop and you're like, Lauren, what's the first thing you think of when you think of a good game? And I'm like, what happens in the first 10 minutes? That's always the question I ask, and it's always the question that people really leave until the end of development. And I say people because I do mean it's not just game developers. Like, I think it's kind of anybody. When you think of your ideal user experience, so many people say, well, here's my game, or here's my app, or here's my tech problem. Here's what the user is going to be able to do. And I'm like, that's awesome, but how are you introducing them to it?
Yeah.
And when we step into this world of Death Stranding, I mean, not just the cutscenes kind of immediately get you into it, but even your first encounter with, say, a BT, or your first encounter kind of with these, with like kind of the mules and the soldiers, like they both give these different aspects of Phantom Pain. And I'm using BTs and I'm using the mules because on the one hand, mules are very much structured like these soldiers that are kind of...
Yeah, definitely a Metal Gear encounter,
It's definitely a Metal Gear encounter, right? Yeah. Mechanically and even visually. You can see it in the way they kind of have their alert status. It's a little bit more subdued, right, than Metal Gear. And, that's intentional because the world is supposed to be a little more, right, serious in tone, a little more kind of everything's diegetic. So their alert status is kind of tied to their body armor / oh my gosh, the flower metallic flower, that is called a thing. That has a name. We're going to get into jargon later, right? But in the visuals, you can kind of see the alert status is very Metal Gear. You also can kind of take over the base by knocking out everybody. Once again, that's Metal Gear. And that was very, very clearly demonstrated and executed well in Phantom Pain. It was one of my favorite experiences of Phantom Pain, is taking out everybody and then you recapture the base. This is kind of the same way. Once mule territory exists, it's the same mechanic. It's the same kind of gameplay loop. But different thematically, right? Same with the BTs, as I think that in Phantom Pain, we had those kind of like skull wispy warriors that came out of nowhere and you couldn't really see them.
The parasites.
Thank
soldiers.
you. The parasites. I called them the skull face misty warriors because, as you can tell, jargon is really my strong suit with Kojima games. And so when the BTs, when they're introduced, how the mist changes, the weather changes, right? How there's a storm around them when they're first introduced and you're like, oh no, what am I going to do? It's almost like kind of beat for beat, the exact same kind of introduction. We kind of get to them where there's nothing you can do at that time, Sam. You got to just run and escape from the BTs, Sam, because we haven't given you the weapons to face them yet, Sam. And I was like, is this the same time when they're like, those are skull warriors, Snake. You can't do anything about those skull people. Make sure they don't catch up to you because then you'll die. And it was like, hey, Sam, you can't touch those things because if they catch up to you, you'll die. That'll be bad. And it was just... That was it, one for one, beat for beat. And that's why I want to talk about the intro and to really kind of highlight that is that the way you're introduced to these things, your way you're introduced to the new concepts of the world and the story is quite frankly very much introducing new players to these kind of classic Kojima enemy types that have come from his time specifically and kind of refining the Metal Gear Solid lore like we saw in Phantom Pain. So thank you for letting me walk through all of that, Nicholas, because I really think that Kojima kind of nailed the kind of tonality and the themes very, very early on in the intro of the experience, which is kind of why it was like, this is just Phantom Pain.
At the same time, though, so this is a yes and.
Yes.
At the same time, the first major mission that you were sent on, which is to take Bridget, the former president of the United States body, up to the incinerator, like that whole experience introduces to you, I think, two things. One, that like traversal itself is going to be complicated and difficult, that you actually are going to have to pay very close attention to. I mean, I think it's a little overdone in Death Stranding 1. It's actually toned down a bit in Death Stranding 2. Like, the rocks everywhere, you can trip over anything. Actually, it has really great traversal mechanics in terms of elevations, like when you're going uphill versus when you're going downhill. It's all very smooth and it's all very intuitive to such an extent that, like, you can actually use one of the classic climbing techniques when going up mountains, and it's very effective. So, like, instead of just climbing straight up the mountain, if you kind of go in a zigzag pattern back and forth, so that, like, each time you go past, it's a more level sort of area that you're crossing, like, that is actually more effective, and it doesn't use up as much of your endurance. So, all of those things are not Phantom Pain really in any way whatsoever. The other thing is that it forces you to experience the openness of the landscape. Because while Phantom Pain technically was quote-unquote open world, the way the missions were structured is that it kind of enforced a sort of like gameplay myopia on you. Like you were focused on a particular area, and if you literally stepped outside of that area, the mission would end. Whereas in this case, because of the expansiveness, it means that, like, if a hazard is put in front of you, if it's a mule camp, if it's BTs, if it's whatever, you don't actually have to engage it, except for certain limited circumstances. It actually, because it embraces the openness of the world, it means that there is a greater degree of freedom in terms of how you address particular challenges that are put in front of you. And that, to me, is sort of like the most important movement away. And to have it be a mission where you are carrying this old woman's body up into the mountains is so rich with folklore, because I don't know if you guys know this, but There is this kind of legendary thing. If you watch the film Ballad of Narayama, it's a sort of a major actually it's the whole film basically, is this idea of sort of like taking like people who are elderly or like essentially on their deathbed up into the mountains to die. It's called ubaste. Probably didn't actually happen historically. It's probably just a legend. But it's definitely this, it's Kojima drawing on it. To me, this is a good example of Kojima understanding like the filmic quality of the games, because instead of being like, oh, he's Die Hard Man, like Die Hard, the movie. Have you seen the movie Die Hard? He's Die Hard Man. Instead of that, which makes me want to stab myself in the eye, it's a very subtle thing where it's like you really have to intuit. You have to, first of all, know what Kojima is drawing on because he's not telling you. And once you do understand that, it sort of gives an interesting tone to the whole experience. The music works really well in those moments too. Like here, Lauren's right. It's hitting on all cylinders. Where I would sort of, I have a mild disagreement is because if you recall, we both thought the first 10 minutes of The Phantom Pain were incredible. The problem was the rest of the game didn't really reflect it. Whereas this game does.
Yeah, and I think that's where, like, I'm so glad you talked about the departure, because I would say that, like, the first 10 minutes, so I had already played, right, the first few hours of this game, like, the whole first map. So that's really, like, Rob had also been wanting to play it, so I let him play the beginning. And let's just say that, you know, you don't always cross rivers well in this game.
You really have to know how to do it, and the game does not tell you how to do it. You
have to know how to do it. So say, like, you know, you're doing this really beautiful folkloric exercise. The music is really sad. It's depressing. Like, it's really, you know, driving toward this tone, and you just say, drop the corpse in the river and just watch it. Watch it go.
Yes,
and then you're also
happen.
paddling in the river. Right?
Yeah.
I have the saved. I had to record it. I had to save it. And the reason why I bring this up, right, is that that's kind of the beauty and the magic that comes from these open world mechanics interacting, right, with the player, with what its intentionality is. And so I'm glad that you mentioned that, because for me, the tone didn't always hit.
No. Unless
I feel the music was playing and or I was the one controlling the sticks, because sometimes music would play, and if you're in a vehicle, right, it's like you're approaching, say, a very important story beat. They usually play music, which was fantastic. But if you're in a vehicle, usually
when you're approaching a new town,
a new town, a new area, it could be story. If you are in a vehicle, the music barely begins and then you trigger the cutscene. And so for those moments, it was like, oh, like I need to physically slow down. And that was something that Kojima's always kind of hinted at in his previous games, where like, hey, slow down, take your time. But in this game, it was very much like, if you run everywhere without a power skeleton, you will drop all of your packages, and this game will be very mad at you. And the game is named Kojima, and he will be very mad at you. So don't make, like, does that make sense? And that's what game director, I think, feels like. Is like, I want you to be slow. I want you to be methodical. And maybe you're fine being super small or super crazy, but now I've given you everything. And something that's very telling for me comes towards the end of the game with this. Where I do think that, before we kind of talk about kind of the characterization, because you did mention Die Hard Man as well, and is that at the end of the game, when you mentioned this open world and how Metal Gear Solid, like Phantom Pain, for me, the story dragged on forever. It felt like you weren't really supposed to interact with the open world. You were just supposed to kind of go there, do missions, and get out. Yep. Right? It was more of like a little play box or a little sandbox. That wasn't actually a sandbox gameplay, just to be clear, everybody. Yeah. Because the metaphor is there.
Well, sandbox in the sense of like when I was a kid, where the sandbox was like a little 4x4 square in my backyard. Yes.
No, this is absolutely, it's the same way. It was absolutely, you parachute in your military men into your sandbox and you parachute him out, because the toys will get dirty if you leave them in there overnight. That was kind of the open world experience. Man, the traversal in this game, yes, top notch. But from a meta progression level, this was the best way to end an open world game I think I have ever seen. This is a pet peeve of mine, Horizon Zero Dawn, which is also the same engine that this game uses. So this is actually very funny.
Okay.
All right, they both use the Red engine. Yeah. This is so fantastic, because at the end of this game, and this is not a spoiler, okay, is it just labels it 2 weeks prior. I'm not even going to tell you prior to what, okay? It's just 2 weeks prior.
Yeah.
And then it's like, hey, now that, 2 weeks prior is to the end, you can do whatever you want. Why don't you take on some missions? It's like nothing ever changed, except now we're going to give you all of the very, very elite upgrades because you finished the game, because you finished the story.
Yeah.
And now you've unlocked all of the traversal. And for me, I had been playing in a world that was truly connected with these really high level, elite porters. They were like, one of them was actually called the Great Deliverer, and they like continued to play. They liked one of my structures. I was like, what are they doing? They're using my road? You mean this world has never had that road? I contributed. It was like a fantastic experience. The Great Deliverer coming in and just being like, smash. And I'm like, oh yeah, smash, like, and subscribe. Come to my world anytime. Drive on my road. But it was so fantastic because I'm using these other structures that, I don't have access to or I've never seen before. We decided not to build. And then suddenly I end the game and I'm like, oh, there's a bunch of stuff that I could do. And during the end of the game, just to say this mechanically, is that narratively you kind of drive back towards another location you'd been to before. Yeah. And you can take deliveries on the way. And so funnily enough, that's exactly what I am doing. I am driving all the way back, taking deliveries with me because I have roads, I've got my vehicles, everything's protected from timefall. And then let's just say at a certain point, they trigger a cutscene and I was like, my vehicle, there it goes into the storm. Like you actually see your own vehicle basically getting swallowed. And I literally, the only thing I could think about is my packages.
It's like the cabbages guy from Avatar.
It is. My cabbages. I was like, my packages. And it was just so brutally like devastating. And here I am being in a moment where it's supposed to be, Sam, like, oh, it's the end of the world, or, like it's the Stranding. Things are happening. Sam, it's terrible. And I can just imagine me as Sam Porter Bridges, Lauren Porter Bridges. It's like, but my packages, that's my job. There it goes. I'm going to get fired. Yes, the end of the world is here.
Yeah,
but I'm
no,
also
you're not going to get fired.
No, you can't get fired as Sam.
Because so the thing is, the theme of that particular mission is that you're trying to race your way back. And
yeah. But I don't want to get, I know this game has been out a while, but it's one of these experiences or these moments where it definitely is so mechanically and narratively linked. But I didn't want to give too much. Didn't want to give too much away. That we are probably going to spoil the ending for sure. So I just think it's funny without spoilers. And I just really, really think that most games trivialize their own story by not creating an incentive to finish it and actually creating an incentive to never finish it, because then the game is both thematically over and all it does is reset you to before the world had that ending that usually could be cataclysmic. However, this game did it in a way that when it reset, it actually felt like it was just a part of the larger game world, and the unlocks for more traversal in a world that incredibly forces you to traverse with multiple different ways, but mainly on foot. As Nicholas can talk about here, and when we talk about characters. In my case,
almost entirely on foot.
Yes, almost entirely on foot. I do want you to talk about that. It's just really, really impressive to me, and it almost sucks that you have to play the whole story to get there if you hate story. But on the other hand, it's like, just do the story, bro, and then get to the end. It's like everyone wins. And guys, that is not only is that challenging from a fundamental narrative perspective and a design perspective, that's fundamentally challenging on a production level, perspective as well. Even though you're thinking, Lauren, it was just a loading screen with the words 2 weeks prior. I'm like, bro, at a big company, you'd have to fight for that loading screen, okay?
Well, I don't necessarily think they had to fight that because that was essentially...
because this is Kojima's story, right?
Yeah. Well, it's also their replayability strategy. It's like if they want the game to be replayable, they have to have something that sort of allows for
but
that.
It has to be a strategy. That word right there has to be a strategy. So, Nicholas, I really want you to talk about your experience.
Okay.
We have to talk about it because we're halfway through and we just gotta...
So Lauren is sitting here being like, it's so amazing how like all of these other people, they're liking your structures and you're building things for them and they're building things for you and you feel so connected. Let me tell you what it feels like to be fucking alone playing this game, because so my general feeling is that like this was a game designed for the PlayStation, for Sony. And I mean, it originally was a Sony exclusive. And then when it was ported to PC, they kind of just went like, essentially like left everything the same and said like, okay, this can be this on the keyboard, this can be this on the keyboard, this can be this on the keyboard. They didn't like fundamentally restructure the controls, which is often what you have to do because a controller doesn't really work the same way that mouse and keyboard do. It's not unplayable, don't get me wrong, but it does mean that, like, for example, the vehicle controls are really bad on PC. And also the vehicle controls in Phantom Pain were really bad on PC, which is why I just didn't use them. And also in Phantom Pain, I didn't use them, and in this game, I didn't use them. Well, I mean, I use them a little bit insofar as, like, you know, when they're introduced to, like, try things out. But when you have this experience where, like, you are the loner, where you are sort of like what Sam thinks he is, which is this guy who's like completely detached from everybody else, doesn't like to be touched, etc., etc., etc. That is an incredibly punishing experience. One, it means that like building the roads is nearly impossible because it requires so much in terms of resources that for one person that it's just not worth doing. And if you're not building the roads as you go along, it also makes using the vehicles themselves a little bit more difficult because you basically have to keep building generators along the way because aside from the long range bike, both the bike and the truck, like they don't have a ton of battery life. And so it got to the point where I was so frustrated with using the vehicles that I was like, well, they actually have these really great like exoskeletons. I'll just use that. And so I actually did a really good job of mixing and matching the various exoskeletons, like the one for climbing, the one for speed, the one that allows you to carry a bunch of stuff. And I traversed the game, aside from the very end where that mission that Lauren was talking about where you have to go all the way back. That was the only one that I used a vehicle for the entirety of it. The rest, I went on foot for a couple of reasons. One, and I think this is actually to Kojima's credit in terms of the design, one of the things that you realize when going places on foot versus like using the vehicles, like even in their ideal state, is that you have so much more control when you're on foot. And control is extremely important in this game because, as I was saying earlier, because of the open worldness, you have this variety in terms of how you can approach things. And if you're up in the mountains, you know, generally the paths open to you are like trudging through the snow where there's going to be 11 billion BTs, or climbing up over the rocks where you can more easily avoid them, but actually have to be a lot more careful in terms of like how you traverse the landscape. You can't do that in a vehicle. You have to do that on foot. And then it causes you to sort of think much more carefully about how you're planning for those things, how much you're carrying, what kind of equipment you're using, whether or not you're bringing along like extra boots, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so all of those things kind of work together to create for me at least, an experience that was frustrating, enjoyable at times, but mostly frustrating, especially, and to me, like, so I am going to spoil something. I'm going to spoil the final BT fight, which is a boss fight. It takes place right in front of Capital Knot City. It's a giant whale. Actually, we didn't really talk about that with Phantom Pain, all of the Moby Dick stuff in Phantom Pain.
We didn't really talk about whales because it was there, but whales are just a very big thing for Kojima.
Yeah,
and
because
that's really it. That's really it. We should just maybe this game is the whale, really.
There is a bit of like Ahabby whaleness in this game too. Anyway, you're fighting a giant whale. And the thing is, to me, it was sort of emblematic of how the way this game is frustrating to me is that it's like it's not a lot of times it's not difficult in like the Dark Souls way, where like there's something that you need to sort of like very closely observe and figure out, or like, you know, do your build accordingly. It's more like it's just a bunch of annoyances piled on top of each other. Like the fact that, you know, the whole area is covered in tar, so like traversal is really annoying. the fact that like hitting the whale in its weak spot, it has to be very precisely timed, but it's also shooting goo at you. You also have like the little guys that come up from the tar and drag you down. And it's just like, to me, it was an extremely miserable experience. And it was kind of emblematic of how I had to struggle so much throughout the game because like literally I was doing it all myself. I was the one building all the timefall shelters. I built all of the zip lines. I built everything. And I was like, and I got to a point where I was like, I feel like I'm just wasting my time doing this. It would be easier for me to just like close in on myself, make sure like I have all the equipment I need and I'm not burdened by all this crap around me. Like I can more easily maneuver through this landscape, even if it's somewhat more slowly, but in a way where it's like I can be very deliberate about what I'm doing. And then as a result, I don't think there was a single delivery that I didn't get an S rating for. And that the fact that carefulness was rewarded, to me, speaks volumes about how Kojima is trying to address... So we talked way back when about how the Metal Gear series at its inception was an attempt to try and conceptualize what an anti-war war game would look like. And in this game, where there are a lot of, I mean, they're literally like, that puts you in battles at certain times, it forces you to deliberate and be much more careful about what you're doing, but not in the goofy way that the Metal Gear games does. In a much more sort of like conscientious, because the ultimate goal is not a military goal. It's different. And because that goal is different, the game, I think, not always, but for the most part, allows you to kind of rethink your strategy, rethink your approach, such that zooming across the landscape in a bunch of vehicles because everybody's like kumbayaing and helping each other out and high-fiving and giving likes is one way to play. But another way to play is to be like, no, I am the loner. I will be fully prepared. I will be the one to do this because I'm the one. I'm the Sam Death Porter Stranding Bridges guy who has to like sort of be the pathfinder out in the world. And there are a lot of pathfindery elements to this. Like, for example, when you're climbing in the mountains. Sorry.
No, go. Sorry, you can finish your thought. I was just going to say that really recontextualizes the ending for me. That I kind of, for me and my play style, which had a community, which had connection, I was not isolated. And I think for me, the biggest kind of struggle I had with the ending is Sam continuously is trying to reject this sense of obvious connection that he has quite physically now. Because that plays a major role in the ending, is that he physically has this connection to other people, right? You actually see him overcome trauma through this game in a way that could even be said is more kind of intimate because you are, say, playing Sam, but it's separated, but you see him kind of overcoming trauma, overcoming grief, overcoming these kind of emotional goals you usually don't get from video games, simply because this is also a movie. In my opinion, like there are just so many cutscenes that it might as well be a movie. But we can get to that maybe like in the Patreon episode as well when we talk more about, you know, the strands in general, you could say. But I
strand
think
is that a metaphor, Lauren?
I'm not sure. It could be literal. Could be a real thing. Is it a metaphor?
Stranding,
also
is that a
real?
metaphor? Is it real? Okay.
So the whole time, okay. And I'm bringing up connection and isolation because if you look this up on Google, right, the AI summary is going to tell you that a major theme of the game is connection versus isolation, and it's not untrue. Okay. Yeah. Obviously, the game is literally tells you need to connect.
Yeah, it says
America.
It says it pretty explicitly.
It's pretty explicitly tells you what it is about, right? Yeah. And it also then explicitly tells you what it's about is like there's some preppers over there that don't want to join the network, but you need to bring them into the fold. So it's isolating, right? I think what mechanically makes this so much more incredible for me as a player is that Nicholas's experience was isolating without the other multiple players in your world space, right? Or that shared area. It's like if you had played Journey, the 2012's Journey alone, and you didn't have another player to help you out, it would have been a really great experience. I think it would have been emotional. It would have been beautiful. And so you still got that. But to have a game whose themes and mechanics and dialogue explicitly telling you that it's about
Yeah.
connection. And that
Yeah.
even at the end of the game, you have a character telling Sam, like, you can't just pretend you haven't changed. And which is also a very, like, very beautiful screenwriting literal line that yet is actually good. And then the other character being like, no, I've changed, but also like nothing has changed because I'm still alone. It made me recontextualize that because your playthrough of Sam, your actual isolationist playthrough, is absolutely a Sam who would say, no, I still did everything myself. I still don't need any of you.
With one
Right? And
exception.
there was,
I would
okay,
say with one exception, and that's the
awesome.
relationship to Lou, but please finish your thought.
Yes. So, yeah, it's interesting. I think it creates layers. I think that's why it is such an interesting story for me as well, is that the narrative there. Now, I would argue, though, that so we talk about this obvious theme, is I just want to say that my true argument for I think what the themes are, because obviously you could say there's legacy, right? Who are we leaving behind? I think a lot of the theme actually comes down to the sub themes of identity again. So same with Phantom Pain. Who is this character? Are they always who they say they are? Are their goals the goals they say they are? Who do they think they are, and are they struggling with that identity? Sam does not struggle with his identity. Even at the end of the game, he's like, I know who I am. But I would say that there's this ideal in this approach, not just of connection and isolation. I think there's a stronger argument that does come from Phantom Pain, that does come from some of the Metal Gear Solid games, around collectivism versus individualism. And so I still think that the reason why thematically this hits as Metal Gear Solid, the Death Stranding, is that for me, is BB a metaphor for kind of the struggle of connecting with others that we have within ourselves? It's like the two wolves. Is Sam's ideology individualistic, right? There's also preppers that say I want the chiral network, but I don't want to be a part of the UCA because I want to like be an individual. I can do everything on my own. I'm self-sustaining. Sam also is very self-sustaining. I'm just a porter. Okay, now you've made me Porter Bridges, but I'm not a bridge. I'm just a guy that carries packages. Okay, now I'm a strand, which is like trying to tell me that I'm connected to everybody. No, I'm a strand, a single strand, right? I'm a bridge to nowhere. And it's that individualism of Sam and of doing things his own way, of being an individual that kind of fights against literally every other, I could say character, because characters are trying to be collective, trying to pull you into their objectives, trying to pull you into different things. I think that and I say characters collectively because they all, as NPCs, I think function as branches and mirrors and reflective attitudes of their individual choices and their individual identities, or kind of their individual strands, you could say. But I think that instead of saying it's just connection versus isolation, I think does it a disservice because of the collectivism attitude. And that having the multiplayer aspect for me, like I built 4 roads all by myself, Nicholas. So like even as a single player, like I built those roads because I was like, I am getting over this mountain the short way, damn it. Like I did that. And the only way to transport the materials to build the roads is honestly to build the road so you can take in a vehicle to build a road, which is just such a cycle. Okay?
Yeah, that just struck me as a waste of time. So that's
but it struck you as a waste of time. But it's because after building that first road and connecting more of the chiral network, I had other players who had built roads or built zip lines or built other ways of traversing. And because I had all of these icons dotting my map, it's like suddenly I went, oh, we're all working together. Right? That's collectivism, right? Versus, no, I'm going to isolate. I'm going to come into myself. And if my body is taken care of, I can traverse this world. Versus I went, no, if I put something in the world, yes, I am taken care of and others benefit. And that's kind of the ideological thing. Versus, I think, just Googling it and saying this game is about connection, right? I think the game is actually about collectivism. So that was a very long thought, but I wanted to get all my themes out there because I don't know, I saw you thinking, Nicholas. So
no, this is really good because it brings me to a topic that I wanted to address, which is that when we looked at the question of identity in the Metal Gear Solid games, we reframed the question, or rather I reframed the question, which is to say that we looked at it in terms of like structural arrangements, because we weren't looking so much at characters as like subjectivities that like particular characters can inhabit from one moment to the next. That's why there are so many different snakes. There are multiple bosses. And that in each case, the identity of the character is not derived from the particular historical circumstances of the individual, but from like the structural position in a kind of social frame that they are meant to inhabit. Now, the reason why I bring this up is because this is actually one way in which you can see that Death Stranding is actually fundamentally moving away from the Metal Gear games, because its protagonist isn't one of these structural subject positions. He is an individual, he is a person, a particular character with a particular history, with particular relations to other characters, and you can't really sort of like identify the identity of Sam Death Stranding Porter Bridges without looking at the particularities of his relationships to other people in a way that you really could with Big Boss, you really could with Snake, because their connection, like everyone was just kind of like moving chess pieces around in those games. Whereas in this instance, I have a really good way to explain this. So when we were talking about the Phantom Pain, I made an argument about the fact that like Quiet isn't a character, she's equipment. And I stand by that because of the way in which she works structurally in the game. What's interesting about Lou is that Lou is a character who is equipment, and yet their story throughout the game is one in which they actually break free of that sort of like social structural subjectivity. Lou becomes a distinct character who will then carry over into the next game as well. And all of that is established throughout the game. It's sort of like the idea of Lou as equipment is broken by the fact that, like, one, the way you interact with the BTs is that Lou is literally helping you out in those moments by seeing them, pointing them out in what directions they are. Like when you leave the BT area, Lou taps you on the shoulder and gives you a thumbs up. Lou gets upset when upsetting things happen, and you have to stop, and you have to pull them off, and you have to comfort them. And what's interesting is that the mechanics of comforting Lou are not intuitive. In other words, if you want to actually calm her down, you need to like tap the button in a very rhythmic, very slow pattern. You can't just like furiously jam the button. You have to go do like you're rocking a baby.
Yeah, and on the PlayStation, you actually do move the controller. The issue is that that you could shake the controller and it does the same thing. It's like
it's just that. That's
but it
not
is true. It's actually if you do it softer and gentler, it does work.
Yeah,
like better. Most people just shake the controller.
And so, like, literally through like the tactile nature of the mechanics, it's sort of like getting you to relate to Lou in this very particular way, not as a piece of equipment, but as an infant. Like, and you then, as Sam, adopt the subjectivity of a parent. And then the theme of like parents and children is also played out through all of like the scenes where you're seeing Cliff through a BB's eyes. Do we want to spoil who that BB is?
No, we don't want to spoil that. I think
anyway,
that Death Stranding is,
You're seeing it through a BB's eyes. And so like you're seeing this relationship from this like dual perspective.
And it's assumed that the BB is Lou, right? Every time you plug in, you are experiencing BB's life, and BB and Lou are kind of the same, right?
Yeah.
And I think that what's really interesting is the layers of storytelling and the layers of characterization that goes through this game's experience in a way that's what you're talking about. You're talking about Sam is experiencing it subjectively, but it also then has the BB element, right? Which is, oh, this is just equipment. Here's what you're going to do. And then over time, you get the story moments with who he ends up naming it Lou, just to be clear, right? Is that it goes from BB to Lou kind of pretty quickly at a very you could say like a climactic interpoint, but it becomes the inciting incident for, well, now Lou is breaking down because it's actually no longer becoming equipment. And you actually have to separate yourself to make it become equipment. That almost now makes you question, wait, is this equipment or is this a character, right? I think as that's the layer of storytelling, all that's going on alongside, oh, by the way, I'm Die Hard Man, please do my main story quests.
Well, I mean, it's a dialectic because, Dead Man is constantly telling you throughout the game that, like, no, this is just equipment, this is just equipment, this is just equipment, you just have to treat it like equipment. And then eventually Dead Man himself even stops treating Lou like equipment.
And I think that that's also the turning point for Dead Man's journey and relationship with treating himself. And I think if that makes sense, because he himself reveals to you that he saw himself a different way, which is why he gave himself / was called the Dead Man. And I was just like, this is beautiful. I was like, this could have been a precursor to something that Guillermo del Toro himself was going to do. And I just think that's hilarious. I was like, the layers and layers. And so what's really interesting here is kind of like to kind of wrap this all up, for me at least, is that when you have a really strong thematic element in your game, it is really only made impactful if it is the mechanic. Because all of the stories that we have talked about today are only possible because the gameplay of Death Stranding allowed them to be strong gameplay features that also through the narrative changed it. I do see that you, Nicholas, brought up something really important in the notes, though, that I want to talk about, because we kind of did say, hey, the open world was really great. But I would like to call out that because the storytelling itself is such a strong feature of this game, at times the open world was incredibly linear. Like, not so much so as it felt linear. That's too soft. It was linear.
Quite literally,
quite linearly. Sorry, quite literally and linearly. It was a very linear game. And I think for anybody that's not familiar with kind of like the difference in types of open worlds, I think that the linearity actually really did help it come through. And also the roads themselves, if you had built them, now actually create a very fast path for the exit. Versus if you don't have those roads, because we didn't really build all of the roads, your road ends, and then you just kind of gung-ho with the vehicle through the mountains and the snow just for a little bit, and you're like, I got this. And you just absolutely hope that you don't crash and burn the vehicle as you dive through a Kylo bridge. And I think that it's a really fascinating case study. So if there's any players and game developers or anyone listening to our podcast today that hasn't given this game a chance or has thought the game is too big, you can absolutely complete the main story on a speed run if you kind of play these games before, right? You're kind of you would say you're an advanced skill level. I think you could beat this story in about 36, 40 hours, which is actually pretty limited. We beat it in I think 47, 50 something. That's including cutscenes and not like skipping them.
Yeah.
And that was actually relatively generous in that we did tag team it and we did do a lot of the side quests. We really did. And I think that it could even be shorter than that. So you would actually get a really good point. And I do bring that up because it has such a really great idea of the thematics, but then the tone doesn't always hit. And that'd be really great to kind of understand what your thoughts are and how this kind of game, whether or not you played it during the pandemic or you played it now in this post-pandemic world, in scare quotes. If it even matters, if it matters to you, or if there's other things that happened, or if you too, like Rob Porter Bridges, dumped the corpse in the river. That'd be great. It'd be great.
Or are we just ending it there?
No, do you want to say something, Nicholas?
Oh, okay, yeah. Well, I'll edit this other.
That's my ending notes.
So. Well, first I want to thank you all for listening, and I want to once again remind you that we have only touched the tip of the iceberg in this particular episode, and if you want slightly more of the iceberg, but definitely not all of it, you can head on over to patreon.com/foodidashi. You can also contact myself on Blue Sky. I am at Academicality. Lauren is at Espresso Cat. However, the thing that I want to leave you with is that I think this is a flawed game, but it does represent an attempt to try and deal with the rut that the Metal Gear games kind of got stuck in. And the way in which they became kind of endlessly repetitive, variations on the same themes over and over and over again, In this game, those themes are actually allowed to open up a little bit. In other words, any given like philosophical concern that a character has doesn't have like a very clear conclusion that is sort of like chucked at you in the way that the Metal Gear games did. In this instance, it's like this character represents a perspective, this character represents a perspective, and this character represents a perspective. And it doesn't say to you that any one of them is more or less valid than the others. Rather, it asks you to try and like dwell in that seeming contradiction and figure it out for yourself. And that is ultimately the connection that you have to make to the game. And that's sort of like where its brilliance lies. And if you want to know where I think its brilliance does not lie, we'll get into more of that in the Patreon episode. So for this month, this extremely hot July in which climate change is bearing down on us, I hope you all are staying safe. I hope you stay cool. And we will either see you in the Patreon or we'll see you next month when we talk Death Stranding 2.